welcome to A Push with Lennox. And today I'm coming to you live from the Death Star Bridge. And why? Because we're talking about the Gilded Age. And for some reason, the Gilded Age tends to be the death of every AP US history student I've ever come across. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk Gilded Age today, and we're going to be focused primarily on immigration and urbanization. So let's go ahead and get started. And as usual, and this is why I think the Gilded Age is so tough, it's the terminology. There are so many terms and people and ideas that you need to understand, and they all kind of overlap with one another. It's difficult to get through all this stuff. So I recommend take it slow. Look at this list. And again, like I always say, if you don't know a term, now's the time to write it down and then pick it up as we talk about it as I go through the lecture. All right. So pause if you need to. I don't mind, because once I'm paused, I'll wait for as long as you need me to. All right, let's get started. During the Gilded Age, you're going to see this huge growth of cities in our country. And there's a number of reasons why this happened. It could be the innovation of our lifestyle. We have all these new inventions, and these new inventions lead to more industrialization, and more industrialization leads to more jobs. And the cities had jobs and people needed them. Now, technology is also going to be supportive in building these cities as well, because don't forget, the Bessemer system had been created to produce steel, and steel was a more inexpensive and stronger metal that could be used now to build skyscrapers. And so we start not only to see our cities grow out, but see our cities start to grow up. First skyscraper was a 10 or 11 stories high. It was built in Chicago. But the other cities are just going to follow suit. You're going to have architects from all over the world competing to see who come up with the best design. Transportation in cities is going to grow as well. You're going to see the evolution of the electric streetcar, and then that's going to grow into subway systems. I think Boston was the first city to have a subway. And another thing that changes during the Gilded Age is the role of women. With all these new jobs being offered, some of those jobs are great for women, and you're going to start seeing women move to cities to take some of these clerical style jobs and stuff like that. And women are going to start to feel more independent. Now, this is different than what we saw in like the 1840s with the Lowell system and stuff like that, because if you lived in Lowell, Massachusetts and worked for the Lowell Mills, you lived a very strict lifestyle, curfews and stuff like that. But now women are able to move into the city and live in boarding houses. And like I said, have more independence. And it's not what we would consider independent today, but it's a start. And it started here with the Gilded Age. Now, with this growth comes a lot of problems. There's going to be challenges that we're going to face. We didn't have infrastructure in cities because we didn't know we needed it. And so as the population grew, the lack of infrastructure really started to become apparent. We didn't have clean water supplies, which is going to breed disease throughout the cities. Trash and sanitation. Whoever thought we need a plan to deal with our trash? If you think about it, if I lived on a farm in the 1800s, first of all, I didn't have that much trash, but if I did, I'd just burn it. I didn't have to worry about hauling it off. Not the case in the cities. And what started happening is people just started dumping their trash on the street. So you had to come up with the infrastructure to deal with this. And then with the mass amounts of people moving into the cities, they had to live someplace. So you see the rise of slums and tenements building. Remember, the dumbbell tenement was the quintessential housing unit in the city at this point. Also, we're having a division of neighborhoods. We're going to see neighborhoods divided by race and nationality. And I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But there are going to be problems, and we're going to have to respond to those problems as our cities grow. Now, when you look at the immigrants coming in, because this contributed highly to the growth of our cities, you had this new wave of immigrants, and they're going to be compared to the old immigrants. We do it in history today, and we did it in real life or in real time back then. Old immigrants came from Western Europe. They were typically literate. They were able to read. They spoke English, and they were skilled. They brought skills with them. Our new immigrants, though, were primarily coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Most of them are what we would consider illiterate in the sense that they could not read or write, especially English. They spoke a different language. The countries they came from had different political systems. They didn't have those democratic ideas that we had brought over from England and other places. And then here's the other thing. most were not Protestant, and Protestant was the primary religion in America at this point. And so Catholics and Orthodox and Jews coming in are going to be seen as a threat. And so when they got off the boat, they're going to be facing discrimination right away just because they're different than what we're used to from other immigrant waves that we've experienced. And because of that, that discrimination is going to drive them to try to find people just like them. So if I'm coming from Russia and I get off the boat and speak no English, cannot write, cannot read, have no skills, and I'm not getting the opportunity that I thought I should have gotten, I'm going to go find people just like me. And so that's how you start to see the evolution of ethnic neighborhoods in our cities that still exist today. I mean, you can go, how many cities have a Chinatown or a little Italy or a little Poland, places like that, a little Havana, down in Florida. So that is how it all got started. So why did they come here? Obviously word got back that there was some discrimination, but they kept coming. There was push and pull factors that brought them in. The pull factors is just the American idea, this idea of democracy and freedom, both politically and religious freedom. And they've been hearing stories about America from people who already lived here, telling them how wonderful the American dream was. And let's be honest, there were jobs. There was a lot of jobs that they could come and get here. Interestingly, what we find though is another reason why people didn't like the new immigrants is because they would work for less. It was a lot of these immigrants that were used as tools of the corporations to fight off labor union strikes. Remember, one of the tools that corporations used to fight unions was scabs. And a lot of these immigrants would come into work as scabs for many of these factories. What was pushing them here was a lot of the same things we saw from previous immigration waves. Loss of jobs. Farming was becoming mechanized over in Europe, and because of that, they didn't need as many people to work, and there wasn't land that they could farm on their own, but there was a lot of land in America. So people were coming here under that Homestead Act, 360 acres you can get for free. So come on over. So they were coming for that. Politically, there was a lot of instability in Eastern Europe. And so they didn't have the freedom that we had here. That's going to be a push factor. And then finally, persecution. Just like we saw persecution of our original colonists, a lot of these people coming over from Russia, especially, are experiencing religious persecution, the Jewish people for one. And so they're coming here looking for that religious freedom that they don't have where they're at now. The response to all this for Americans is going to be, like I said, the rise of nativism. Ellis Island is going to open up in 1892, the quintessential picture of immigration for America that we herald and celebrate today, but at the time it was seen as a threat. Our native population, they were going to look at these immigrants through racial views, economic, political, and religious ideas. It's just like they put on these goggles with these four topics, and that's how they viewed these people. Racially, they saw them as inferior. Economically, they saw them as a threat. Politically, they were radical. They might try to undermine the government that we have in place right here. And religiously, man, they're mostly Catholic and Jewish. They're not like us. They're completely different. And so those differences scared us. Let's be honest. That's what drove nativism, was fear. And so because of that fear, you're going to see a rise of American nationalism or nativism during this time. And then over several decades, we're going to see the government get involved as well. They started with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the very first immigration act that was focused on race and nationality. That will be followed up with the Quota Acts of the 1920s. But it wasn't just the government. You also saw immigrants being subjected to things like literacy tests. If you want a job, well, first you have to prove that you're literate, and you got to take this test in English. Oh, you speak Czech? Sorry, you can't get a job. And then also you had groups forming up like the American Protective Association that was combating against all the Catholics coming into our country. So this is how America was responding to all this at the time. But there was another side. There were a group of people who said, no, we should help them. And that's what we refer to as the social gospel movement. Now, don't confuse the social gospel movement with the gospel of wealth. The gospel of wealth was based on social Darwinism and the rise of capitalists in our country who said, we are stronger, and because of that, we need to help the weaker. And we're going to do it by giving them libraries and schools and stuff like that. That's different than the social gospel movement. This was based on the local churches, and Christian churches said it's our responsibility to help combat urban poverty. We're going to go in as Christians. We're going to share our faith, but we're not just going to share our faith. We're going to share our food. We're going to share places to live. We're going to, share training to help these people get on their feet. We're going to do what we can to help. And several groups are going to get involved in that. The Salvation Army, which got its start in England, is going to come over here to America. And they're going to help work with the poverty-stricken areas. And again, still sharing the Christian message while they do that. The YMCA and the YWCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, the Young Women's Christian Association, again, stepping in to help where these people could not do for themselves. And that was the role of churches during this time. We don't see that as much today. We've kind of given that mantle, we've handed it over to the government. But in the Gilded Age, going into the early progressive era, it was the churches that provided relief for those who were, uneducated, economically depressed, discriminated against. That was the role of the churches at the time. You also had the settlement house movement start. Now, Jane Addams is going to be famous for the Hull House, but there's going to be numerous settlement houses throughout the cities of America. And their goal was to provide social services for the community. It could be training for a particular type of job. It could be learning to read and write. It could be childcare while someone went out and interviewed for a job. Whatever it could, they tried to help the immigrants coming into America adapt and assimilate into our society. And that was the real big challenge of the immigrants coming in during the Gilded Age, is it was very difficult for them to assimilate and become part of the American community because they lacked the skills. And I'm just talking basic skills: English, reading and writing, stuff like that. All of these beliefs, everything that you see that, is growing during the Gilded Age is going to become the foundation of the progressive movement. The Gilded Age showed us what was broken. The progressive age showed us we needed to fix it, and we're going to try to fix all these problems. Now, there's a couple different viewpoints of why this is happening, or what should be done. Horatio Alger believed in what was called the Protestant work ethic, that honest, hard work will lead to success. This has always been part of the American ideal. You can go all the way back to the Puritans. Remember the Puritan work ethic? Kind of the same thing, that if you work hard, if you live an honest life, if you live a good life, success will come to you. He's going to write, Alger being that, he's going to write books, these dime store novels that will sell, and they'll have a lot of rags to riches stories in them about people who just pulled themselves up and got out of the slums and built a life for themselves. And he had the perfect example of that every time. Andrew Carnegie, who came over as a Scottish immigrant, and he did just that, started with nothing and built that steel empire. So, and it started with early on working with transportation, but he moved out of that into steel and built U.S. Steel. There's going to be some critics of that saying, no, it ain't that easy, Horatio. Henry George and Edward Bellamy are going to say, because of the inequality in our society, there's no way certain people will ever be able to get out of the poverty they're in. Henry George wrote Progress and Prosperity that looked at those inequalities and said it's because of the rise of industry, it's because of the laissez-faire attitude of our government that this schism of inequality exists between the rich and the poor, and it's up to them to fix it. The government has to get in and fix this and take care of it all. Edward Bellamy said took it even further. He wrote a book, a story about a society that was based solely on socialism. And they had no economic injustice or anything like that. They just lived the perfect utopian socialist lifestyle. And he said, we can reach that as well. Now, you had arguments like these on both sides. But what you're going to see as we move into late 1890s, into the 1900s, everyone starts seeing these problems in our society. And beyond the social gospel movement, people are starting to say the government really does need to step in and start helping. So efforts are going to start to take place to fix the problems of the Gilded Age, and we're going to call those efforts the progressive era. So you have to understand one to understand the other. Finally, I want to talk about African Americans because sometimes they get kind of pushed to the back and we forget that they're still fighting for their rights during this time. And two men, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, are going to introduce their views on how African Americans should get equality in the American society. But to understand their difference, you have to understand the difference of their past. When we talk about HIP, analyzing documents, that one of those P's is point of view. And to understand the difference between these two men, you have to understand their different points of view. Booker T. Washington was a slave. He grew up in the South, and that's what he came out of. And so coming out of that, he wrote this book called Up from Slavery. He does become successful. He is educated. He actually creates the Tuskegee Institute to help other African Americans gain skills. He believed that African Americans, through education, through vocational training, they could have self-respect. And with that self-respect, they could then start building their lives economically. And with economic success, they would gain the respect of other Americans. And that respect is really what's going to lead to equality in society. On the other side, W.B. Du Bois said, it's not that easy. He said from the North, he had never been in slavery. He actually had a PhD from Harvard, and he helped create the NAACP, the National Association of Advancement for the Colored People. He said, rights are promised to us based on the Constitution right now. We demand political and social equality now. And if we have to fight for it, we will fight for it. We don't have to wait for respect. It should just be given to us. And that was his argument. Both of these men had a clear-cut vision for what a life for an African American in America should be. They just had different paths to get there. All right. So if you're asked to talk about either of these guys in an essay or something like that, make sure you take their point of view into consideration, because that really explains what they're coming from and where they're coming from. Okay. All right, so that's it. That is immigration and urbanization during the Gilded Age. Hopefully that answered any questions. Hopefully you're walking away with a little bit more knowledge about the period and maybe not so intimidated by the Gilded Age. I might be on the Death Star, but the Gilded Age does not have to be the death of you. So hang in there. If you have questions, post them in the comments below. I'll set up a link to other parts of the Gilded Age for videos that I've done. Other than that, I hope to see you soon and just keep learning. All right, have a fantastic day.